In 1962, more than 100 people still lived in Centralia, Pennsylvania, above 10 mined beds of anthracite. By 1984, Congress had set aside $42 million not to extinguish the fire beneath them, but to buy their homes and move them away. Eventually, 545 homes and businesses were acquired. The buildings came down. Part of Route 61 closed. The zip code vanished. 5 people remained in the 2020 census. Beneath the surviving streets, the fire burned on. America had abandoned the town, not the fire. About 320 million years before anyone drew a street across Centralia, there was no mountain there. There was no narrow valley, no line of wooded ridges, and no anthracite waiting beneath the ground. The land that would become eastern Pennsylvania lay low and nearly level, crossed by slow rivers and broad floodplains where stagnant water collected among dense stands of plants unlike anything that grows there now. There were no oaks, maples, pines, or flowering grass. Tall, narrow trees called lepidodendron and sigillaria rose as much as 100 feet above the wet ground. Calamites, relatives of the small horsetails that now grow beside streams, formed jointed trunks 20 to 40 feet high. Ferns spread beneath them. Leaves, bark, branches, roots, and entire trunks fell into shallow water, where the lack of oxygen slowed their decay. Layer by layer, the plant matter accumulated into peat. Then the rivers moved. Water spilled over their banks and carried sand and mud across the swamp. The sediment buried the peat, pressed it down, and sealed it away. New swamps formed above the old ones. New forests grew, died, and sank. Another flood arrived. Another layer of mud covered what remained. The process repeated so many times that the coal-bearing rocks of Pennsylvania eventually formed a sequence more than 4,000 feet thick. Sandstone, shale, conglomerate, and dark bands of compressed vegetation laid one above another. At first, those bands were nearly flat. As more sediment accumulated, its weight squeezed water from the peat and closed the spaces between fragments of wood and bark. Burial carried the material deeper, where heat drove away moisture and gases. Peat became lignite, then bituminous coal, and finally, under the more intense conditions of eastern Pennsylvania, anthracite. A representative sample of Pennsylvania anthracite is about 94% carbon. It is black, hard, brittle, and sometimes polished enough to reflect light from a broken surface. It was an unusually concentrated form of buried heat. The next transformation came when the rocks themselves began to move. Roughly 250 million years ago, the continental bodies that would become North America and Africa pressed together during the formation of Pangaea. Rock in eastern Pennsylvania was compressed, folded, broken, and pushed northwestward. Layers that had formed flat were bent into long troughs and arches. Some coal beds tilted steeply. Elsewhere in the anthracite region, seams were turned until they stood nearly upright. The same pressure helped raise the rank of the coal. The swamps supplied the carbon. The mountains finished the work. Erosion then spent millions of years cutting into the folded mass. Softer shale and coal-bearing rock wore down more readily. Harder sandstone and conglomerate remained as parallel ridges, enclosing narrow valleys and preserving the coal inside folded basins. The landscape around Centralia became part of Pennsylvania's western middle anthracite field, a mass of bent and faulted coal-bearing rock extending through portions of Columbia and Schuylkill counties. Seen from above, the country resolved itself into forested slopes, saddles, ravines, and strips of lower ground. Seen in cross-section, it was something else entirely. Coal beds curved beneath the surface, rose toward daylight along one slope, then plunged again under the next. The ground possessed a direction that could not be seen from the ground itself. That distinction matters. Centralia sits near the Locust Mountain anticline, an upward fold separating deeper troughs in the coal field. Near the base of the Llewellyn Formation lies the Buck Mountain coal bed, the seam that would later feed the Centralia mine fire. Across much of the affected area, It runs roughly 100 to 150 feet below the surface. Its depth changes as the bed tilts. Its direction changes as the rock folds. A flame entering that structure would not advance across a flat underground floor. It could follow the coal downward, divide along the fold, and move in several directions at once. Long before the fire, that geometry determined how the coal would have to be reached. Miners could not simply remove the top of the ground and lift out a level black sheet. They would need shafts, slopes, tunnels, gangways, and rooms, cut according to the pitch of each bed. They would follow the coal rather than the compass. Passages would overlap at different depths, joined by openings for men, water, coal, and air. By the time the workings beneath Centralia were mapped, 10 named coal beds had been mined there. The number is worth holding on to. 10 layers of fuel, 10 buried surfaces created by vanished swamps, folded beneath a piece of land small enough for a person to cross on foot. The people who arrived later would read only the upper half of the landscape. They would see a route through the ridges, timber on the slopes, and level ground where houses might stand. They would lay rails where locomotives could climb, and streets where wagons could pass. Beneath them, miners would construct another network whose lines followed the angle of the coal. The surface would have blocks, intersections, and property lines. The underground would have rooms, pillars, gangways, and collapsed spaces. Before Centralia had its first street, it already had its second map. In the early 1840s, Centralia was one building beside a road. The Bull's Head Tavern stood along the old Reading Road on level ground between the ridges, where wet soil, brushwood, and tall pine had once made the site look less like the beginning of a town than a place travelers might hurry through before dark. For roughly 12 years, the tavern was the settlement. There were no blocks, no borough offices, no railroad avenue. Only the road, the inn, and the coal folded beneath them. The Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company acquired the land in 1842. What the company possessed was not yet a town in any practical sense. It was a position above a mineral deposit, and anthracite underground was useful only if it could be carried away in quantities large enough to justify reaching it. A wagon could move coal. A railroad could turn it into an industry. The Mine Run Railroad, completed in 1854, provided that outlet. Tracks followed the valley toward markets beyond the mountain, allowing loaded cars to leave where wagons had once struggled against distance, grade, and mud. Coal from beneath the Centralia area could now travel to furnaces, factories, and household cellars far from Columbia County. The mountain had acquired a door. Alexander W. Rea arrived as an engineer and agent for the company. In 1855, he built a cottage above the Bull's Head and began surveying a settlement. Several streets were drawn parallel to the Reading Road. Others crossed them at right angles. On one of those cross streets, the company erected a row of houses, and company employees moved into them almost immediately. That row was the practical beginning of Centralia. The arrangement above ground was orderly. A road became a reference line. Parallel streets created long blocks. Cross streets divided those blocks into lots where houses, stores, churches, and sheds could be placed. Property could be measured, occupied, rented, sold, and taxed. Straight lines made the land understandable. The coal did not share this preference. Beneath the new grid lay 10 named coal beds, each descending through the folded rock at its own depth and angle. The miners called them veins, although they were layered seams. Buck Mountain, 7 Foot, Mammoth, Holmes, and others stacked through the earth beneath the burrow. Some were thick enough to justify large workings. Others narrowed, split, or disappeared into faults and folds. A street surveyor followed the compass. A mining engineer followed the coal. The resulting underground map bore little resemblance to Rea's rectangles. To enter a seam, miners drove a slope downward through the coal, or opened a passage into the side of the mountain. From there, gangways extended along the bed, with working chambers cut away from them. In the steeply pitched anthracite country, some of these chambers climbed with the seam. Passages connected passages. Openings for haulage and ventilation spread outward as the miners removed coal from the dark face and sent it toward daylight. They could not remove everything. In room and pillar mining, large blocks of coal were left standing between the excavated spaces to support the roof. Approximately half the coal might remain in place while an area was being worked. That number is worth pausing over. The coal left underground was not merely coal the company had failed to sell. It had become part of the structure holding up the rock above, and above that rock stood the houses. The town was therefore not simply near a mine, nor was the mine a single hollow chamber beyond its edge. Centralia was being constructed directly over an expanding system of slopes, gangways, rooms, and coal pillars. The surface and subsurface were developed at the same time for the same business, according to two incompatible geometries. One produced right angles, the other bent with the mountain. By 1860, Jonathan Hoagland had opened a store opposite the Bull's Head. A post office followed in 1862. The settlement was known as Centreville, but another Pennsylvania community already used that name in the postal system. Rhea proposed Centralia instead, and the place acquired a name that belonged to it alone. The same year the post office opened, the Centralia colliery began cutting into the Mammoth Bed. Its first slope descended roughly 350 feet along the coal. In 1862, the colliery shipped 401 tons. The following year, it shipped 19,278. In 1864, the figure reached 67,138 tons, a dark procession of anthracite that no wagon road could have carried at that pace. 3 years had turned an opening in the ground into a current of coal. More collieries appeared around the settlement. Locust Run, Coal Ridge, Hazel Dell, and Continental. Each had its own surface structures and its own reach underground. Breakers rose near the workings, where coal was crushed and sorted before shipment. Tracks gathered the finished anthracite and carried it outward. The names on the company ledgers multiplied, and so did the blank spaces on the mine maps. In 1865, the Lehigh and Mahanoy Railroad built through the town itself. Its tracks ran along Railroad Avenue, connecting Centralia more directly with the anthracite network beyond the valley. The railroad no longer merely served mines outside the settlement. It passed between the growing blocks, close enough for the vibration of loaded cars to belong to the daily life of the street. Centralia was incorporated as a borough in February 1866. It now had a legal boundary, elected offices, named streets, occupied houses, a store, a post office, and rail connections to markets that could consume what the mountain contained. But the borough boundary existed only on the surface. Below it, 10 coal beds crossed beneath homes and lots without regard for property lines. Slopes descended. Gangways lengthened. Rooms widened while pillars remained between them, carrying the weight of rock, soil, streets, and timber houses whose occupants could not see what supported them. Above, Centralia followed the surveyor's grid. Below, it followed the coal. In 1890, the federal census counted 2,761 people inside Centralia. The number represented the borough at its largest, but it did not describe a temporary camp of miners sleeping beside a coal opening. These were households arranged along named streets, children moving through schoolrooms, congregations raising money for roofs and foundations, merchants stocking shelves, hotel keepers making beds, and families measuring their days by the movement of coal beneath them and railroad cars beyond their doors. Centralia had become a complete town. By then, the damp opening around the old Bull's Head Tavern had been drained and divided. Locust Avenue and Railroad Avenue ran through blocks of timber houses, shops, meeting halls, and public buildings. Colliery structures stood near the edges of the borough, where breakers crushed mined material and separated hard, shining anthracite from slate and waste rock. The machinery gave the valley an industrial voice. On the railroad, loaded cars carried the sorted coal away while empty ones returned to be filled again. The coal moved east. Money, supplies, and people moved back. 7 churches served the town at its peak. So did 27 saloons. The two numbers occupied the same streets without canceling each other. Centralia also contained 5 hotels, 2 theaters, a bank, a post office, and 14 general and grocery stores. A resident could deposit wages, collect a letter, buy flour or lamp oil, attend a performance, enter a church, or walk into a drinking room without leaving the borough. 27 saloons for 2,761 people meant roughly 1 for every 100 residents, including children. That number is worth pausing over. It reflected a town built around heavy labor, cash wages, boarding arrangements, long shifts, and men who often lived near the people with whom they worked underground. The saloon might sell liquor, but it also provided a warm room, news, company, and a place where a miner could find someone who understood the sound of settling rock. The churches performed another kind of gathering. Methodists first organized in Centralia in 1863 with a class of 8. When their church was begun 3 years later, members excavated the foundation without spending money on the labor. Presbyterians and Episcopalians erected their own buildings. St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Parish began holding Mass in a schoolhouse in 1869, after miners had endured an 8-month strike and the congregation had no church property and little money. The coal company donated 4 lots. By November, a church stood on them. Within 3 years, St. Ignatius counted 1,500 souls in its parish. The church, rectory, and cemetery together cost $22,000, a sum assembled in a place where much of the cash entering town had first been earned in darkness. Stone, timber, glass, and burial ground converted wages into permanence. Centralia's schools carried the same confidence, although the ground had already issued a warning. The first school building, erected in 1858, served for a decade as the town's principal gathering place. Methodist, Catholic, and Presbyterian congregations all organized there before their churches were ready. Then the schoolhouse was swallowed by a mine cave-in. The historical record states the fact plainly. A building intended for children and public meetings stood above excavated coal, and the ground beneath it failed. Centralia replaced it with a larger, substantial school building. The response was not to move the town away from the mines. The mines were the reason the town had enough children to require a larger school. Water also had to be engineered. The first company built a reservoir on the side of Locust Mountain and laid wooden mains toward the borough, but the pipes decayed. A later system placed a dam across Brush Valley Run, raised another reservoir on Locust Mountain, and connected them with 3 miles of underground mains. Water traveled beneath the streets above coal workings that had to be continuously pumped to keep water out. The two systems occupied the same mountain for opposite purposes. Centralia's civic life extended beyond churches and municipal offices. The Independent Order of Odd Fellows maintained a lodge. The Patriotic Order Sons of America met there. Miners joined labor associations and the Knights of Labor. By the middle of the 1880s, District 16 of the Miners and Laborers Amalgamated Associations contained 4 branches and about 800 members, while 2 local Knights of Labor assemblies together counted another 240. Those organizations reveal something the mine payroll alone cannot. Centralia's residents were not merely employees passing through company property. They formed committees, elected officers, collected dues, rented rooms, organized funerals, debated wages, built halls, and placed institutional names above doors. Their town had acquired layers that did not appear on a colliery map. Still, coal paid for nearly all of it. An 1882 report listed 7 workings in or around Centralia that together produced more than 500,000 tons in that year alone. The Logan Colliery accounted for 231,169 tons, enough to make every street and storefront seem small beside the volume leaving the ground. Centralia Colliery added more than 88,000 tons. Hazel Dell, Continental, Bear City, Morris Ridge, and North Ashland contributed their own streams to the railroad. Every ton passed through several hands. Coal was cut from the face, loaded underground, hauled toward the opening, lifted or pulled into daylight, broken, cleaned, sorted, weighed, and placed in railroad cars. The process required miners, laborers, engineers, breaker workers, track crews, clerks, and managers. Around those workers stood grocers, teachers, priests, ministers, hotel keepers, bankers, postal employees, and children who had never entered a mine but lived entirely within its economy. If you had stood on Railroad Avenue in 1890, Centralia would not have appeared temporary. Church steeples rose above the roofs. Storefronts faced the streets. A large school building held the borough's children. Hotels received travelers, theaters offered stages, and railroad tracks carried black cargo through the valley. The census counted 2,761 people. Below their houses, the 10 coal beds continued to be divided into rooms and passages. Above them, almost every feature of an established community had taken physical form. Reservoirs, mains, rails, halls, stores, schools, churches, and rows of occupied homes. Centralia had reached its greatest population. The streets were full. In 1950, the federal census counted 1,986 people in Centralia. That same year, the Borough Council acquired rights to the anthracite beneath the town. The two facts sat uneasily together. Nearly 2,000 residents still occupied the surface, while their municipal government took legal control of coal embedded in pillars, narrow remnants, and partly exhausted beds below their houses. Centralia had been built because private companies wanted that coal. Now the borough claimed what the companies had left. It did not acquire an untouched mountain. The erosion had begun years earlier, although it did not arrive as a single closing day. Anthracite faced competition from other fuels, and the large companies that had organized the collieries, breakers, rail sidings, and payrolls began withdrawing from workings that no longer promised the same return. After the financial crash of 1929, the Lehigh Valley Coal Company closed 5 mines in and around Centralia. A company could close a mine on paper. The coal remained underground. During the Depression, men without regular colliery work entered idle workings or opened small, unauthorized mines of their own. These operators were known as bootleg miners. Some sold coal locally. Some worked seams the large companies no longer considered worth the expense. Their mines required fewer offices and less machinery, but they also operated beyond the engineering, ownership, and inspection systems that had governed the company workings. The easiest coal had already left on railroad cars. What remained was often harder to reach, less profitable to remove, or necessary to keep the mine standing. That included the pillars. In the first stage of room and pillar mining, miners had cut chambers through a coal bed while leaving large blocks between them to carry the weight of the roof. A pillar could be wider than a house. It was fuel, but it was also structure. The mine's architecture depended on coal that had deliberately not been sold. Removing pillars was not always illegal. In a planned retreat operation, miners could take them in a controlled sequence, beginning deep in the mine and working back toward the entrance while the roof collapsed behind them. The process required accurate maps, experienced supervision, and an escape route that remained open until the men reached the surface. Bootleg miners sometimes practiced a rougher form of the same procedure. They entered abandoned workings and cut coal from the pillars because the coal was already exposed and often of good quality. They too might work from the rear toward the opening, staying just ahead of the roof as its support narrowed. The margin was measured in coal and stone. As pillars were reduced or removed, the pressure shifted to those still standing. Roof rocks sagged. Timber supports broke or decayed. Sections of passage collapsed. sometimes filling a room with shattered rock and sometimes transferring the weight upward until the surface settled. The first Centralia schoolhouse had already disappeared into a mine cave-in decades earlier. Now the same process continued through workings that no longer had a company responsible for maintaining them. The damage did not create one clean, empty cavern beneath the burrow. It created something less orderly: open rooms beside fallen rooms, intact pillars beside robbed pillars, narrow passages beside masses of broken rock, some workings filled with water. Others remained connected to shafts, slopes, ventilation routes, and cracks through the folded strata. Later estimates based on mine maps suggested that Centralia may originally have contained approximately 25 million tons of coal across all its mineable beds. Between half and 7/10 of the coal in each worked bed had been removed. What remained was not one solid reserve waiting beneath the streets. It was scattered through 10 seams, mixed among roof supports, barriers, damaged passages, and coal that could not be recovered economically. The distinction would matter enormously once something began burning below. A mine fire does not require a broad open hall. It requires coal, heat, and enough oxygen to continue. An old gangway can carry air. A crack through fallen roof can become a chimney. A collapsed section may block one route while forcing gases through another. Workings in separate beds can be connected by shafts, tunnels, fractures, and passages cut during different periods by different operators. The surviving mine maps recorded much of Centralia's underground structure. But no collection of drawings could guarantee that every bootleg opening, damaged pillar, collapse, or later connection appeared exactly where it existed. A line on paper might represent a passage that had fallen shut years before. A blank space might conceal a small unauthorized working. This was the underground property Centralia inherited. The transfer had been enabled by a Pennsylvania law passed in 1949. Historical accounts commonly state that the borough acquired the rights to all anthracite within its boundaries the following year. Later state records use more guarded language, saying that Centralia claims ownership of some, if not all, of that coal. The uncertainty would remain dormant for decades, then reappear when residents and Pennsylvania officials argued over who controlled the land and what might still lie beneath it. Mineral ownership was separate from the houses above. A family might own its home and surface lot, while another entity controlled the coal below. By acquiring the mineral claim, the borough placed its own name beneath the names of the people on the property map. The purchase also preserved an expectation. Coal mining around Centralia had contracted, but it had not vanished. Nearly 2,000 people remained in town. Centralia still operated schools, maintained streets, supported churches, and governed itself. Coal still heated buildings and still left the region by rail. A mineral right could therefore look like an asset held for a future in which anthracite might again justify the cost of reaching it. But ownership did not rebuild a pillar. Between the population peak of 1890 and the mineral purchase of 1950, Centralia had lost 775 residents, more than one person in 4. Houses remained occupied. Children still crossed the streets, and the borough still appeared complete enough to acquire the resource on which it had been founded. The change below was harder to count. Coal had become rooms. Rooms had become collapses. Pillars had become fuel again. On the surface map, Centralia was divided into streets and private lots. On the mine maps, the same ground was divided into beds, slopes, chambers, barriers, and supports. The borough had bought the coal. It had also bought the spaces between it. On May 7, 1962, Centralia's Borough Council discussed garbage. The problem was ordinary and visible. Refuse had accumulated in unauthorized dumps around the town, and the borough had recently begun using an abandoned strip mining pit as a municipal landfill. The excavation lay just outside the borough boundary, along the eastern edge of Oddfellows Cemetery, close enough that the approach of Memorial Day brought the condition of the dump into sharper view. Families would soon come to tend graves. The borough wanted the waste cleaned up. The pit had been excavated around 1935. It was roughly 75 feet wide and 50 feet deep, a ready-made cavity where household refuse could be deposited without digging a new one. But a strip pit in anthracite country was not simply an empty place in the ground. Its walls and floor had been cut through coal-bearing rock near older underground workings. A landfill inspector had noticed openings in the pit and warned a councilman that non-combustible material would be needed to separate the refuse from the mine. A properly constructed barrier of shale or similar material could isolate burning waste from carbon-bearing material in the walls and from passages beyond them. That barrier was incomplete. The council hired 5 members of Centralia's volunteer fire company to clean the dump before the holiday. The account most widely accepted today, reconstructed by journalist and historian David DeCock from interviews and records, is that the men gathered the refuse into one section of the pit and deliberately burned it on May 27. After the visible material had burned down, they used fire hoses to soak the ashes. It was a familiar method of reducing garbage. It also violated the basic condition that made the pit usable. Fire had to remain separated from the coal. The Borough Council's surviving minutes do not state that the firemen were instructed to ignite the dump. That absence leaves room for a second account. Author Joan Quigley concluded that the refuse may already have been burning when they arrived, possibly because a trash hauler had deposited hot ash or discarded coal from a household furnace the previous day. Later council records referred to fires at the landfill, while the firemen submitted bills for fighting them. The distinction is small on the ground and large in the record. In one version, the cleanup crew lit the fire. In the other, the crew came to extinguish a fire that had already begun. There were older theories as well. Some residents believed that a fire associated with the Bast Colliery in 1932 had never been completely extinguished and had eventually reached the landfill from below. Frank Yergill, who worked a bootleg mine with his brother near the pit between 1960 and 1962, rejected that explanation. If a mine fire had already been moving through the workings where they labored, he argued its heat and gases would have reached them. No surviving record identifies the first spark with certainty. What can be established is that refuse was burning in the pit during the final days of May, and that the fire did not end when the surface flames disappeared. On May 29, flames were visible again. Firefighters connected hoses from Locust Avenue and soaked the dump a second time. On June 4, another flare-up brought them back. A bulldozer moved through the waste so water could reach material smoldering beneath the upper layers. Garbage can burn unevenly. Paper, cloth, wood, food waste, ash, and discarded household material collapse together, leaving pockets where heat survives beneath a wet surface. In Centralia's pit, the refuse lay beside carbonaceous mine waste and exposed coal-bearing ground. Heat could move from one fuel to the next without producing a wall of flame. The fire went downward. During the cleanup, workers uncovered an opening at the base of the pit's north wall. It was approximately 15 feet long and nearly 3 feet high, large enough for air, smoke, and heat to pass through. Deposited garbage had concealed it, preventing the opening from being filled with non-combustible material before the dump was used. Beyond that opening lay the damaged geometry built during the previous century. The fire did not descend into a single mine, with one entrance and one set of intact rooms. It reached the Buck Mountain coal bed near a network of abandoned workings shaped by company mining, pillar removal, bootleg excavations, roof falls, and connections between passages. Coal remained in pillars, along chamber walls, and in portions of the bed that had never been removed. Timber and carbon-bearing debris provided additional material. Open gangways and fractures supplied air. Anthracite does not ignite as easily as paper or wood. It must first absorb substantial heat. But once a section of coal is hot enough to burn, the underground setting can preserve that heat. Rock holds it. The surrounding mine shields the burning coal from rain. Openings and cracks admit oxygen, while shafts and collapsed areas allow hot gases to rise. The same passages that had carried coal toward the surface could now carry air toward the fire. At first, the visible evidence remained concentrated around the dump. The firemen could wet what they saw. A bulldozer could turn over refuse. Men could stand at the edge of the pit and look directly at the blackened material. The underground workings offered no comparable view. A miner's map could show where a gangway had once been driven, but not whether it remained open, had collapsed, or connected with an unrecorded bootleg excavation. By the time the opening in the north wall was exposed, the problem was no longer limited to burning garbage. Heat had reached material beyond the reach of an ordinary hose. Smoldering coal could advance along a bed, stop at a collapse, turn through another passage, or move upward through broken rock. Water poured into one opening might never touch it. Nothing at the surface announced how far the heat had traveled. Odd Fellows Cemetery remained beside the pit, its graves arranged on ground that families had visited before there was a municipal landfill at its edge. The cleanup had been scheduled because those families were expected to return for Memorial Day. The visible refuse could be moved, burned, or covered. The headstones could be trimmed around and washed. Beneath the adjoining pit, the fire had entered the town's second map. In October 1963, crews were digging an isolation trench east of the Centralia mine fire when heat was detected on both sides of it. The trench was still incomplete. The fire had not crossed a finished barrier. The barrier had taken longer to build than the fire had taken to move. By the time Pennsylvania stopped the work, the excavation had cost $36,250, and the line intended to separate burning coal from cold coal already contained fire on each side. Centralia had not begun with a trench. It had begun with water. When fire was discovered in the refuse pit in May 1962, borough workers poured water onto the burning material and covered part of the area with clay. Water could cool what it touched. Clay could reduce the oxygen entering from above. Neither reached all the heat moving through the Buck Mountain coal bed and the abandoned passages connected to it. By July, the underground fire had traveled nearly 200 feet along the coal bed. Dense vapor and fumes escaped from fissures in the strip pit's high wall. Carbon monoxide moved through old Centralia colliery workings into nearby active mines, prompting Pennsylvania to close 23 operations and putting 140 miners out of work. The fire was still small enough to excavate if its boundaries could be located and all the heated material removed. Engineers estimated that 24,000 cubic yards of earth, rock, and coal would have to be dug out, quenched, and replaced. They placed the cost at near $30,000. On August 22, a contractor began cutting into the northern edge of the pit. The estimate did not survive contact with the ground. By late October, the machinery had removed 53,580 cubic yards, more than twice the expected volume, and the fire had advanced beyond the excavation. Opening the old workings also admitted fresh air. The machines were not merely chasing heat through rock. At times, the digging improved the fire's supply of oxygen. The project stopped after spending $27,658. The hot material had not been completely removed. That distinction matters. Direct excavation was one of the most reliable methods available for extinguishing an anthracite mine fire, but only when the excavation reached every burning edge. An incomplete cut did not remove the fire. It exposed more of the structure around it. The next plan attempted to build a wall underground. Beginning in November 1962, workers drilled 80 boreholes in a semicircle around the affected area. Through them, they pumped water and 10,000 cubic yards of fine breaker refuse into the old mine voids. The material was supposed to fill rooms, close air passages, and form a non-combustible barrier ahead of the flames. Winter entered the project. Water lines froze. The machine used to grind material for the slurry froze during a blizzard. Some mine rooms accepted more fill than expected, while others remained only partly closed. On March 15, 1963, the money was exhausted. The flushing project had cost $42,420. Steam later appeared farther east. By May, visible effects of the fire extended 700 feet from the point of origin. In 11 months, the burning front had advanced roughly 500 feet along the coal. Pennsylvania considered 3 new plans: a complete trench enclosing the fire, a partial trench combined with more flushing, or a larger flushing operation. The full excavation was the most expensive. The partial trench was selected because it appeared attainable with the money available. It was the trench that remained open in October when fire appeared on both sides. By then, Pennsylvania had spent approximately $106,000. The amount had purchased excavation, boreholes, water, clay, breaker refuse, and an unfinished fire break. It had not purchased control. A larger federal and state project followed after passage of the Appalachian Regional Development Act. The plan approved in 1965 divided the work into 2 phases. First, abandoned strip pits would be backfilled, exploratory holes would define the fire, and temporary underground barriers would restrain it. Then crews would excavate a permanent isolation trench about 2,500 feet long and between 100 and 200 feet deep. The entire project was initially budgeted at $2.5 million. Exploratory drilling found that the fire had traveled farther north and east than expected. The mine contained voids large enough to swallow more filling material than engineers had calculated. During the first phase, workers drilled 116 exploratory holes and 97 flushing holes, then pumped 81,000 cubic yards of sand into the workings. The temporary work cost more than $326,000. It also revealed that the permanent trench would need to descend more than 300 feet through hard rock. Its estimated cost rose to $4.5 million. The trench was replaced with underground barriers. Crews drilled into the Buck Mountain 7-foot and Skidmore beds and injected sand, clay, and fly ash into the rooms below. Fly ash was the fine mineral residue collected from the smokestacks of coal-burning power plants. A waste produced by burning coal above ground was carried to Centralia to restrain coal burning underground. The western barrier alone required hundreds of boreholes and more than 39,000 tons of fly ash. An eastern barrier followed. During its construction, a high-temperature breakthrough appeared in a section that had already been completed, requiring additional drilling and material. Work stopped for months while officials obtained more funding. By the end of the 7-year federal and state project, approximately 1,635 holes had been drilled. Workers had injected more than 122,000 tons of fly ash and flushed more than 117,000 cubic yards of sand underground. The total cost reached nearly $2,800,000. The fire remained. Temperatures later rose in monitoring holes on the cold side of the barrier. Carbon monoxide appeared in some of them. The fill may have settled, leaving cracks through which gases could pass, or the barrier may never have closed every fractured and collapsed space. In steeply pitched workings, slurry naturally ran toward lower points instead of remaining where a vertical wall was needed. Centralia tried reinforcement again in 1978. Workers removed 150,600 cubic yards of burning material, injected another 7,180 tons of fly ash, and drilled 58 additional boreholes. A proposed cut-off trench extending toward Poplar Street, was abandoned because its excavation would have required the destruction of several privately owned homes. By the end of that year, state and federal agencies had spent approximately $3,300,000 trying to control the fire. Eventually, more than 2,000 boreholes would be drilled around Centralia to locate, monitor, or restrain it. Each steel casing was a narrow view into a vast damaged structure. Below them, the fire needed only a small supply of oxygen. Old gangways, roof falls, cracks, and unsealed rooms provided it. A barrier could close the passage shown on a mine map, while air reached the coal through a passage the map did not show. The machines stopped. The appropriations ended. The trenches remained in the ground. The fire kept using the mine. On Saturday, February 14, 1981, 12-year-old Todd Domboski was in his grandmother's backyard when the ground beneath him began to give way. First his legs sank into the soil. Then the earth dropped farther, carrying him below the surface into warm mud and rising gas. Todd reached for the exposed root of a nearby tree and held on while the hole widened around him. His 14-year-old cousin, Eric Wolfgang, heard him shouting and ran across the yard. Eric reached into the opening, caught Todd, and pulled him back onto solid ground. The hole was reported to be about 4 feet across, with a void descending roughly 150 feet into old mine workings. Gas pouring from it contained enough carbon monoxide to kill a person who remained there. Todd had been below ground for less than a minute. For nearly 19 years, the Centralia fire had been discussed through maps, drilling logs, funding requests, coal temperatures, and lines drawn across property parcels. The danger could be made to look orderly on paper. It occupied colored zones beneath streets and moved between boreholes identified by numbers. In the Domboski yard, it had opened beneath a child's shoes. The warning had been entering homes long before the ground collapsed. In May 1969, 3 families near Wood and South Streets temporarily left their houses after investigators found too little oxygen and traces of carbon monoxide in a cellar. Carbon monoxide offered no smoke to follow and no smell to identify. It could pass from abandoned mine passages into broken rock, through cracks in foundations, and across basement floors while the rooms above still appeared unchanged. By 1979, the United States Department of the Interior had placed gas monitors in 15 Centralia homes. Carbon monoxide detectors went into 10 houses at first, then 5 more. In some basements, instruments found elevated carbon dioxide and depleted oxygen close to the floor. Residents with chronic breathing problems faced the greatest risk, but the measurements did not stay neatly within property lines. One cellar registered gas. The house next door might not. Metal pipes were fitted over openings in the ground to carry sulfurous fumes above the height of a person's face. They rose from yards like narrow chimneys without buildings, releasing the breath of mine rooms that had been abandoned decades earlier. The underground network that had once moved men, coal cars, timber, and air was now moving heat and gas beneath kitchens and bedrooms. At John Coddington's service station, the fire reached another part of daily life. In November 1979, steam began rising from a vacant lot beside the station. One measurement placed the steam at about 122 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to make a winter patch of ground behave like an open vent. Soon vapor was coming through the station's dirt basement floor, where investigators recorded a temperature of approximately 136 degrees. Beneath the station stood 4 tanks capable of holding a combined 9,000 gallons of gasoline. That number is worth pausing over. The fuel was stored not in a distant industrial yard, but under a roadside business above a coal fire whose exact boundaries remained uncertain. The gasoline was removed. The tanks were filled with water. The station closed in December 1979. Elsewhere, cracks appeared in pavement and soil. Some released steam. Some widened after rain or frost. A depression might be caused by the fire-consuming coal, by the collapse of an old chamber, or by mining damage that had been waiting underground since the last timber supports rotted away. Investigators could not always separate one cause from another. Centralia had been built over rooms, pillars, tunnels, shafts, stripped pits, and illegally worked seams, many of them altered after the surviving maps were drawn. As coal burned, the material supporting the surface weakened. Rock settled into the spaces below. Streets buckled, lots sank, and openings supplied fresh oxygen to the fire. The collapse fed the thing that helped cause it. A federal study prepared around 1980 described a borough of roughly 1,200 people living in about 500 homes. Investigators estimated that approximately 500 residents and 310 structures were already affected or might eventually be affected by the fire. Nearly half the town stood inside an area of possible danger, though the danger did not present itself equally from one block to the next. That unevenness divided Centralia. Some residents believed the Domboski sinkhole proved that the fire had moved beyond any acceptable limit. Some wanted the burning ground excavated, regardless of cost. Others favored relocation before another cellar filled with gas or another yard opened. Still, others believed state and federal officials were enlarging a localized problem into a reason to dismantle the borough. Their experiences gave each position something solid to hold. A family living over hot ground could point to a detector, a cracked wall, or steam coming through soil. Another family could point to a cool basement, an undamaged house, and decades of predictions that had not reached their street. Property values, mineral ownership, government compensation, and the meaning of risk became tangled together. Two sociologists studying Centralia would later identify at least 6 community factions in a borough small enough for people to recognize one another's cars. Todd's fall did not settle those arguments. It changed their scale. The old shaft beneath the yard had reportedly been filled years earlier. Heat and mine gases loosened the material until it could no longer carry the weight above it. From the surface, the grass had concealed the failure. Below, the earth was already moving. Engineers had sunk thousands of boreholes around Centralia. They had installed steel casing, sampled gases, measured temperatures, and reconstructed mine passages from incomplete records. Yet on that February afternoon, none of those systems held Todd Domboski above the abandoned workings. A tree root did. In 1983, the United States Office of Surface Mining placed a price on extinguishing the Centralia fire, $663 million. Stopping it would require excavation on the scale of a new mine, cutting through hundreds of feet of rock, removing burning coal, and isolating whatever could not be reached. The work would take years, consume part of the town it was intended to save, and cost almost 16 times what Congress would soon spend on a different solution. The second number was $42 million. Congress appropriated that amount at the end of 1983 for the voluntary purchase of homes and businesses threatened by toxic gases and collapsing ground. The relocation program began in 1984, administered by Pennsylvania with federal money. Centralia would not be evacuated in a single morning. It would be appraised and removed one address at a time. The choice was expressed in budgets rather than ceremony. $663 million to attack the fire below, $42 million to purchase the town above. Families who wanted to leave had their houses measured and compared with property in nearby communities. Kitchens, porches, bedrooms, garages, and years of repairs became square footage on appraisal forms. The state's average expenditure came to approximately $52,000 for each relocated household. Enough to buy another home in the surrounding coal region, but not enough to replace the exact arrangement of neighbors, churches, sidewalks, family graves left behind. Once an owner accepted the offer, the Commonwealth acquired the property, and the occupants moved. A demolition contract followed. Windows disappeared, roofs came down, walls were broken apart, and the debris was removed. The house did not wait empty for another family. Between 1985 and 1991, the program acquired 545 residences and businesses across Centralia and the surrounding fire zone. The number described more than buildings. Each acquisition removed customers from stores, children from streets, volunteers from fire companies, and parishioners from pews. A block could lose one house, then three, then the remaining structures between them. Grass grew across the cleared parcels while paved streets continued past places that no longer required an address. The government did not purchase every piece of ground. Vacant lots remained under their previous ownership, and the residential streets were not removed. What disappeared were the occupied structures. Centralia became a town whose grid survived its contents. The road out was also changing. In 1983, subsidence damaged Pennsylvania Route 61 badly enough that the state spent approximately $500,000 stabilizing it. The fire had consumed or weakened coal pillars beneath the pavement, allowing the surface to settle. Repairs kept traffic moving for a time, but a damaged section roughly 4,000 feet long was eventually closed. Even the highway could no longer be treated as solid ground. Most residents accepted relocation, though not always for the same reason. Some had found gas in their basements or heat beneath their property. Others had watched Todd Domboski pulled from the hole in his grandmother's yard. Some believed that remaining in a shrinking town would leave them with a house no buyer would purchase. By 1990, only 63 residents remained in a borough that had held about 1,100 when the fire began. For those who stayed, the voluntary program produced a different kind of pressure. A person might reject the offer and keep the same house, yet lose the family next door, the business across the street, and the row of homes at the end of the block. Demolition made the decision visible. Each cleared lot widened the distance between the remaining buildings. In January 1992, the Centralia Task Force moved from voluntary acquisition to condemnation. Proceedings began against 53 remaining properties, justified by the continuing danger from poisonous gases and subsidence. The owners objected in court. They argued that conditions differed across town, that some houses showed no dangerous gas readings, and that the state should not take sound homes merely because the fire might someday reach them. Then the coal beneath Centralia returned to the argument. Decades earlier, the borough had acquired claims to mineral rights under parts of the municipality. Now Centralia itself sued, arguing that condemnation of the surface amounted to a taking of the coal below. Among some holdouts, the belief grew that relocation concealed another purpose: control of valuable anthracite left beneath the empty streets. The Commonwealth had not purchased mineral rights through the relocation program, nor was there a reliable figure for the value of the remaining coal. Mine maps suggested that miners had already removed between half and 70% from each worked seam, while the fire had burned or damaged an unknown share of what remained. Recovering the rest would have required working through collapsed passages, hot rock, poisonous gases, and fractured supports. The coal existed. Its recoverable value did not exist as a settled number. The courts ruled against both the property owners and the borough. Condemnation continued, although a handful of residents remained through years of appeals. In 2013, the state reached an agreement allowing the remaining residents to stay in their homes for the rest of their lives. After each resident died or chose to leave, ownership would pass to the Commonwealth, and the house could be removed. Centralia had not been abandoned through a single order. It had been converted, parcel by parcel, from a lived town into government-owned ground. The houses were purchased, the deeds were condemned, the walls were carried away. The fire was left beneath the streets. Centralia did not become a wilderness when the houses came down. The streets remained, climbing the same grades and meeting at intersections laid out for a town of miners, merchants, priests, children, and coal trains. Curbs emerged from weeds. Utility poles stood beside empty lots. A driveway might leave the pavement, cross 20 feet of grass, and end where a kitchen and front porch had once occupied the ground. The last residents remained inside this emptied grid. Their 2013 agreement with Pennsylvania did not reverse the condemnation of Centralia, but it allowed them to occupy their homes for the rest of their lives. When each resident died or chose to leave, the property would pass to the Commonwealth. No new owner could take the place. No could buy the house and begin again. Centralia, therefore, continued to exist in two different ways. Pennsylvania still listed it as a borough, a legal municipality in Columbia County. Its municipal building remained standing with the fire station garage attached, one of the few public structures left among the cleared lots. Yet by late 2003, Postal Code 10927 was no longer active. The remaining residents received their mail through nearby Ashland. The town still had a government address. It no longer had its own place in the mail. South of the borough, the abandoned section of Pennsylvania Route 61 preserved another piece of the retreat. About 4,000 feet of roadway had been closed after fire-weakened coal pillars allowed the pavement to settle and crack. Traffic moved onto a smaller road around it. For years, the broken highway collected painted names, dates, slogans, and layers of spray paint until the asphalt became better known for graffiti than for the cars it had carried. In 2020, the private owner covered much of the old roadway with loads of earth to discourage trespassing. Grass and young trees began taking hold above the pavement. The highway was not repaired or removed. It was buried. An asphalt road placed beneath soil because the ground beneath the asphalt could no longer be trusted. Inside Centralia, steel pipes still rise from streets and former house lots. Most were installed to measure underground temperature or sample gases. A few served as chimneys, lifting mine fumes above the level of doors and basement windows. They are narrow, ordinary pieces of metal, the visible ends of a monitoring system reaching into passages where miners once left pillars of coal to hold up the town. Pennsylvania continues to inspect the fire and monitor conditions beneath the surface. By 2012, the mapped fire area had expanded to approximately 400 surface acres, though the burning remained irregular. 400 acres did not mean one continuous furnace. The fire occupied patches, fronts, old rooms, fractured coal, and passages where enough oxygen reached the fuel. One section could cool after its coal was consumed, while another reheated when collapsing rock exposed a fresh surface. That made Centralia quieter without making it finished. The Commonwealth warned that even cooled ground could release toxic gases through a chimney effect or collapse as weakened mine rooms settled. Grass growing over a former block did not certify the rock below it. A monitoring pipe might show heat where no smoke appeared, while steam emerging from a crack might have traveled some distance from the burning coal. The fire and its surface signs were not required to occupy the same address. Above them, the borough took on the outline of its original street plan without most of the structures that had given the plan a purpose. Locust Avenue, Center Street, Wood Street, and South Street continued across the mountain. Trees spread into former yards. Mowed grass marked the properties of the remaining residents. Elsewhere, foundations and steps disappeared beneath vegetation, leaving roads to divide fields into the dimensions of vanished blocks. The population, counted in thousands during the coal years, had fallen to a handful. Those residents did not live in abandoned houses. They maintained homes inside a borough where nearly every surrounding structure had been removed. Lights still appeared in windows. Cars still used the streets. The legal settlement gave each household time measured not by a government deadline, but by the life of the person inside. Beyond the houses, Centralia's cemeteries remained. Their survival was partly legal, partly familial, and partly geological. The relocation program purchased residences and businesses, not grave markers. Families who had left the borough could still return to fenced ground containing names that preceded the fire, the mines, and in some cases the incorporation of Centralia itself. Stone did not require a postal code. Odd Fellows Cemetery stood near the southeastern edge of the old town, enclosed by its iron fence. Beside it lay the former strip mine pit, where the fire was first detected in 1962. Before Memorial Day that year, the pit had contained municipal refuse. Smoke and heat appeared near the cemetery boundary, and from that point the fire entered a story of mine openings, trenches, boreholes, basement gases, condemned deeds, and demolished streets. More than 6 decades later, heat can still appear near a corner of the cemetery. It can create the impression that fire is moving directly beneath the graves. State investigators, however, found that most ground beneath Centralia's cemeteries either contains no coal or was physically isolated from the coal by excavation. The nearby fire may send heat toward the surface, but the earth beneath most of the stones does not provide it with fuel. Outside the fence, streets pass through grass, where houses once stood directly above 10 coal seams. Monitoring pipes rise from lots without buildings. Farther down the mountain, the old highway rests beneath dirt. Inside the fence, the headstones remain in rows. The fire passes beside them.